Both Matthew and Mark record the journey of Jesus to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he has an encounter with a Gentile woman we'll look at in just a moment. Let's read at least a portion of the text, just so that we're familiar with it. We're in Mark chapter 7, beginning with verse 24. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Does anybody read any differently than that?
I just said Tyre.
Tyre, okay.
It just says vicinity of Tyre.
Okay, well look at the, if you have a good footnote, you might want to check that out. But there's a manuscript difference. We'll talk about that momentarily. He arose, went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him, and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the reign of the Decapolis. Okay, that's the text we're going to focus in on. Now, Mark is mentioning some places, some names. It's very purposeful. It is intended to elicit a response. He wants you as the reader, particularly his initial readers, to have a reaction. What do you think that reaction is? Why is he leaving the Jewish people? Even in the story, you get kind of a bit of that with the crumbs, the breadcrumbs, feeding of the dogs, and so forth. We'll talk about that more in a little, but I think Mark wants you to react as you read this, especially if you were one of the early readers, that Jesus is leaving the Jewish boundary, even though he's leaving Galilee, which is primarily I don't know that primarily, but it's a international place. Lots and lots of people are there, but it's Jewish territory, technically. In the biblical narrative, authors often mention places to communicate a message, and oftentimes it will be a theological message. Well, what would the theological message be by mentioning, for example, Tyre and Sidon and the Decapolis? All of these are Gentile territories in this story. What's the message? He's for everyone. Even though they weren't halfway across the world, he's for everyone. Looking at the map up here, you got the Sea of Galilee. Jesus hangs out at Capernaum a lot. Tyre is up here. Sidon just north of that. And he mentions he leaves and he comes down to the Decapolis. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but the message is, this is for Jew and Gentile. We're going to talk about it some next week as well when we briefly go back over the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000. Those were different audiences. One Jewish, one primarily Gentile. Jesus was trying all along to get us to see this message is not just for the Jews. It's for the world. It's for whomever will listen, learn, accept, obey. So you have to be careful. There are some arguments made that Mark is confused. You know why Mark is confused?
Jesus would have never went there.
Well, Jesus never would have gone there, okay? What else? There's something else that's kind of illogical. But unless you know your map, you wouldn't notice
You
it.
wouldn't have gone from Tyre north to side and then
Yeah.
back down to
It
Galilee.
says he left Tyre to go to Galilee, but he went north to Sidon to do it. Kind of like you're going to go to St. Louis, but you're going to go over to Harrisburg and up to El Dorado and Carmi and head up the way to the interstate and then go to St. Louis. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
No, that wouldn't make any sense, but what would make sense is that those two places are representative of the whole world,
Yes.
representative of all the Gentiles. They didn't have to go to the rest of the world because it represented that.
Right.
In life, especially.
And it also says that Sidon, or my commentary, that's 25 miles north.
Yeah, it's north of Tyre, but it also said he went from Tyre to Sidon to the Decapolis to Galilee. All right? So some people look and say, "Oh, bless his heart, Mark's just confused. He didn't really know. He didn't know geography he wasn't well traveled. Or he's not very purposeful in his writing. He just he's got some mistakes here." Well, I think we should possibly consider geography and literary significance and think along the ways that they thought instead of our contemporary American ways of thinking, and you might find a little bit of a difference because we are very linear in our thinking. Point A, point B, A, B, C, D, E. You got to get through all of those. Okay, that's a very American way of thinking, but the Jewish mindset was not linear at all, but rather categorical. So it didn't bother Mark and his readers to hear that he would have gone from Tyre to Sidon to the Decapolis to get to Galilee, because he wasn't necessarily trying to give you an itinerary. He was just trying to give us some theological concept that Jesus is visiting the world. It's vital importance that you pay attention to geography and the references utilized. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight, more so than the healing. We understand that Jesus can heal, and that's a great study, but that's not the focus tonight. Mark is aware of geography, and that's what I want to focus in on. And his use of references, geographical references, demonstrate that Jesus' kingdom is not limited to Judaism. It isn't limited to the Jews. It was always for the Gentiles as well. And so Jesus decides to travel outside of the comfortable corridor of Galilee, Judaism, and to get out there into Gentile territory. And what do you think his followers, his disciples, thought about it?
We're always upset about it.
They probably were a little upset, kind of like Jonah.
They had the consideration, they didn't have the understanding that Gentiles were on the planet.
Yeah. This is akin to when they went into Samaria and sat down, and Jesus sat down at a well and wanted to talk about the Samaritan and help her. They probably thought, why? That doesn't make sense. But he was always unconventional. I mean, is there anything conventional about Jesus? Is there anything, maybe it's not the right word, but traditional?
In the Matthew reference that you give, they say this sinner would get rid of it
Yeah.
and water.
They don't want anything to do with her. Remember, during a famine in Israel, Elijah performed a miracle for a Phoenician woman at Zarephath. Jesus is copying that. I mean, those are parallel accounts, if you will. And that was in the region of Tyre and Sidon, 1 Kings 17. And so Jesus is really kind of modeling here something that Elijah did. He's showing himself a great prophet. He's showing himself to be very unconventional, but conventional all at the same time. They just don't want to open their eyes and see it. Now, let's get some context. Prior to his journey to Tyre, he's facing opposition. We're in Mark 7, verse 1. He's facing some opposition. He's in Galilee. The Pharisees and the scribes have come all the way from Jerusalem. It says, now the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem. To make sure you get that, they're way down here in Jerusalem. Jesus is way up here in Galilee somewhere, and they travel all the way up there. For what purpose?
Testing.
To test him. And they'll do this fairly regularly. Go ahead.
Questioning.
Question him, yeah. They have heard he has some pretty controversial teaching. So they've come up to question his interpretation of the law. What is their topic of concern? Tradition. Let's read the first 5 verses. Now the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem. They saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled. That is, unwashed. Basically, what's the issue? They don't wash their hands before they eat. Boy, they'd get upset today, wouldn't they? Verse 3, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, holding to the tradition of the elders. That's key right there. Verse 4, and when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? The topic of their concern is ritual cleansing or washing before you eat a meal. What does Jesus say? Calls them a name. What does he call them?
Hypocrites.
Hypocrites. And what does that mean, literally? Actors. He says, you bunch of actors. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you've handed down. And many such things you do. He goes on and on. But notice the next verse, and we could get into all of what Jesus is saying. That's another class, another time. Sunday morning Mark class, we'll get into it. Watch verse 14. He called the people again and said, hear me all of you and understand. There is nothing outside a person. You haven't marked this, you need to. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. When he left, his disciples asked him about the parable, and he goes on and talks about it, much like what we talked about this last Sunday morning. If you have ears to hear, let him hear. If you don't understand this parable, how are you going to understand the rest of them? When he says there's nothing outside the man that can defile him if it goes into him, but the things that proceed out of the man, what's he talking about? The heart. But that's a bold statement. It isn't what you put in your body. It's the things that come out of you. And that brings great opposition. Look at verse... Well, I wrote down verse 18. Well, I don't see it at the moment. Maybe it was in Luke. But basically, there is such a ruckus, such a stir, that he decides to get out of the area. But not going down to Jerusalem, not going down into the den, the thick of it, not hanging around here because we've caused such a stir. So he goes north. He gets out of Dodge. He gets out of town. Mark 6 tells us, verse 53, when they crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret, moored to the shore. That's the last place mentioned. So we're supposing he is at Gennesaret. Anybody have a good map of the Sea of Galilee? Where is Gennesaret? Up there by Capernaum?
Yes.
So he's somewhere in his home base. You notice he really doesn't travel very far from Capernaum on average. He generally stays right there on the shores of the sea. He will go down to Jerusalem occasionally, and he passes through Samaria. But mostly he stays right there in and on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. But this time he's headed northwest, up to Tyre.
It's actually closer for him to go to Tyre than Jerusalem,
Yeah,
by a long shot.
right. It is closer. Probably easier to do. He doesn't have to worry with the Samaritan land and issue.
I definitely agree that he's doing this to get away from the reach of the Pharisees from Jerusalem. And I definitely agree that he's doing this because he wants to show his disciples that this message is for all the world. But historically, geographically, Tyre and Sidon were supposed to be in the kingdom of Israel.
Zebulun?
Yes, Judges 1:31 maybe, Joshua 6:13. That was supposed to be Israelite territory.
Right,
So he's going to the house of Israel as God decreed it.
right.
Now,
But the people...
there's probably Jews there. I mean, his answer to the woman makes it clear. I'm not saying that he doesn't want to help her. I'm saying his answer makes it clear he is there to see Jews.
Yes.
But God sees that as Jewish territory geographically.
And he's
Now,
probably trying to reach them.
correct. There is a spiritual truth beyond that, but I'm saying we can't ignore the fact that in God's mind that is supposed to be Israel.
Yes. I believe it's the tribe of Zebulun, if I'm not mistaken, that's supposed to be up there.
Yeah, and then of course all the region of the Decapolis was clearly supposed to be Israel as well. So if you took that on that map, we don't even see the southern tip. But if you basically cut that land mass out, that was basically all supposed to be Israel, right?
Yes.
That was the borders of it in that picture.
Correct. Well, some manuscripts in Mark 7 and verse 24, some will say just Tyre, and some will say Tyre and Sidon. There's a manuscript difference. It's not a big deal for us because basically they're right there together anyway. Not really going to deal with that because that's just not an issue for me. But Jesus gets there in the region of Tyre. Mark doesn't tell us if he gets into the city of Tyre or just stays somewhere in and around it. He's in the region. And when he gets there, he specifically tells us he tries to do it on the secret. He tries to get there unnoticed. But it's not possible. Verse 24, he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. Yet he yet he could not be hidden. Why do you suppose that is?
He's already known.
He's known everywhere. News travels fast. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have TV or radio, but boy, news traveled fast.
Fast donkeys.
Yes. He
I'm
goes
trying to
into
figure
a...
out,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I'm just trying to figure out why he doesn't want, why he wants to keep it secret. I mean,
Maybe it's part of that messianic secret. You know, don't go and tell anybody what happened. Maybe it's just he wants to accomplish some things and he knows he can if the crowds
Yeah.
gather around. Could be any number of reasons. We're not really told.
well, it also really spreads the word, I guess. Now that I think about it, you try to keep something secret and it's not going to be kept secret. People are going to talk more
Right?
and it's going to spread the...
Could be that reverse psychology
Yep.
angle. Could be a lot of things. We're not told if the resident of the house is Jewish or Gentile that he goes into. We do know that the woman who comes to him, who hears about it and comes to him, is Gentile.
The disciples don't ask him to send her away because she's Gentile. They ask him to send her away because she won't shut up.
Yeah. She's bothering.
Yeah.
She's intruding. Well, the inhabitants of Tyre have a historically rocky relationship with the Jews down in Galilee. Not necessarily the Jews that are there in Tyre. They have in some ways acculturated themselves to the area and the land of Tyre and Sidon and around there. But the Jews of Galilee and Judea, they have a problem with. A number of the sources suggest the tension between the Phoenician coast, which is what they call this, and Galilee all happens prior to the New Testament. The prophet Joel condemns Tyre and Sidon because they sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks, Joel chapters 3 and 4, as slaves. So they were involved in kind of the slave trade. And so there is some dislike. Tyre's economic development impacts the Jews living in Galilee. They had it's not very far, and they can do business there if they want, or they can not. And apparently they're choosing at the time to not do business down in Galilee, and that creates some dislike. Gerd Thiessen suggests that the Tyrians, he calls them, puts an economic strain on the Galileans, and there's bad blood between them. What do they call it? What do you call it? They are, what do you call it when you don't shop somewhere?
Boycott.
Boycotting, if you will. The sources highlight this tension between the inhabitants of Tyre and the inhabitants of Galilee and provides context. Why would Jesus be going up there if there's bad blood? Well, you could ask another question. Why did he go to Samaria?
Why would he go to Jerusalem?
Why to Jerusalem?
Why did he come to earth?
Why did he come to earth?
One step further.
Because he wants to see all people saved. He wants them to hear the gospel and to accept an obedient faith. But the people don't see it. His disciples, I'm sure, are struggling. And that also, Jesus' statement about the unfairness of taking bread from the mouths of the Jews can also be seen in this context, because the people of Tyre are withholding their funds from Galilee, from buying and doing commerce, and it's taking bread out of the mouths of them. Then we're going to come back up there, but before time runs out, it says he goes from Tyre up to Sidon, and then he goes to Decapolis on the way to Galilee. So let's go down and talk about Decapolis momentarily. The term Decapolis means 10 cities. Just Just to give you some idea, the Sea of Galilee is up here. This is Decapolis down to the southeast. It means 10 cities in Greek. It refers to a group of very Hellenistic or Greek-cultured towns on the east and the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. They're all located east of the Rift Valley. That would be the Jordan River. That's the Rift Valley, except for Scythopolis. Scythopolis is over on the Israel side, if you will. But it's part of the Decapolis. And is the largest of the cities, at least in the time of Josephus. The Decapolis consisted of a group of cities from Damascus to the north down to Philadelphia in the south. It's a pretty large area, way up north of the Sea of Galilee, all the way down south of Jerusalem. If you had lines going straight across, in other words. Now, the creation of the Decapolis is unknown. In fact, the oldest documentation of the Decapolis is the New Testament. It's the oldest you've got talking about it. Some say Alexander the Great in 332 BC and his arrival of Greek Hellenistic culture created the Decapolis. Others say it's Pompey in 63 BC, part of his annexation of the region of Syria and Palestine on the behalf of Rome. It's long been fought over. The Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Nabateans, the Israelites, they've all fought over the territory. Roman intervention led by Pompey brought relief, brought boundaries, ended anarchy, and brought structure. But again, the oldest usage of the term is in the New Testament. Matthew 2 and Mark 5. Let me read to you this description. This is from Pliny the Elder, who comes along a good bit after the New Testament, but this is his description. Adjoining Judea on the side of Syria is the region of the Decapolis, so called from the number of its towns, though not all writers keep to the same list. In other words, they don't even agree on which 10 cities it is. Nobody knows the original 10. Most, however, he says, include Damascus, with its fertile water meadows that drain the river Crisoro, Philadelphia, Raphna, Scythopolis, where a colony of Scythians are settled, Gadara, past which flows the river Yarmouk, Hippo, Dion, Pella, rich with its waters, Galasa, and Kanatha. Josephus mentions the Decapolis 4 times in his writings and says that Scythopolis is the largest of the 10 cities. So just a basic, I just wanted you to know that they are very, very Greek, that area. Very Greek, very Gentile, very educated, very wealthy, very cultured, museums, education, commerce, temples galore to the deities, Greek gods and goddesses. It only says that Jesus went to the Decapolis. Doesn't tell us which city. But why would Jesus go to this very Greek, very Gentile, very educated, cultured place? Why would the Apostle Paul?
They still need Jesus.
They still need Jesus. They need to hear the gospel. So he goes down to the Decapolis. Now, Mark's description of Jesus returning from Tyre to the shores of the Sea of Galilee raises some questions, which we've talked about. It's not a very direct route at all. In fact, it's a very indirect route. And Mark describes that Jesus and his disciples go from Tyre up to Sidon, the opposite direction of the Sea of Galilee. And then they went into the midst of the Decapolis, which means they go east, past the Sea of Galilee, across the Rift Valley, eventually coming back to the Sea of Galilee. a far greater direct route exists. I mean, if you just draw a line, there are mountains and things you've got to get around, but there is a much quicker way to go than the way Jesus did. If Mark is telling us this is the route he took. That may not be what he's telling us. He may just be telling us Jesus traveled to these places to preach the gospel. And they're not primarily Jewish. But when you think about it, neither is Galilee. I mean, it's primarily Jewish. It's in Jewish territory and in Jewish boundaries, but it's a very international place and culture. So in an attempt to understand Mark's supposed mix-up, some suggest he is confused. But here are some possible explanations, and I didn't mention this one earlier. When you think about it, have you ever heard anyone say Sidon and Tyre?
Yes.
Yes.
Jesus.
Okay.
Matthew 11.
Did he mention Sidon first?
I don't remember, honestly. I think he definitely mentions Tyre.
Okay.
But they're a synecdoche. If you say one, you mean both.
Yes.
So,
But every reference, Tyre and Sidon. Sidon always comes second. Probably because Tyre was much greater, much more. It was the region as well as the city. But you never read about Sidon unless you're reading about Tyre and Sidon. Particularly in Scripture. And in most other, if not all other, literary references. So he's just going by what was commonly accepted. Not necessarily saying Jesus went from Tyre to Sidon, which would be north the wrong way.
Matthew 11:22, Jesus himself refers to them in that order, Tyre and Sidon.
Tyre and Sidon.
Preaching to the unrepentant city, Jewish cities. If I'd have done these miracles in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented.
Yes.
So he goes to prove that
Yes.
later in the book, in chapter 15 of Matthew.
So he could just be following, and if you look in particularly the Septuagint version, but Jeremiah 47, Joel 3, Matthew 11, Acts 12, on and on we could go, Tyre and Sidon, every time. And, again, he's just trying to say he went to non-Jewish territory. What is Jesus' last recorded words to his disciples? Pardon?
In all the world, preach the gospel.
Go into all the world. Go to Acts chapter 1.
Wait here until you receive power, and then you'll be my witnesses, first in Jerusalem, then in Judea,
Yes.
and Galilee, then into all the world.
Yes. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. Yes, the Great Commission is one of the last things. But the very last thing, you're going to go into all the world. Now, what do you think they thought?
All the world they did.
Yeah, literally, it's you're going to go to the ends of the earth. All the world is our English translations, but literally, it's you're going to go to the ends of the earth. What do you think they thought?
How are we going to do this?
How? But he's modeling for them, in some ways, by stretching out from the comfortable boundaries. If he had stayed right there on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, do you suppose we ever would have heard it?
Been a footnote.
Would have been a footnote in history, maybe. I really want to believe the power of God is greater than that, and we would have, nonetheless. But Jesus is, Jesus is modeling for them, we're going to go into all the world.
Isn't Mark's audience mostly Gentile? That's who he wrote for.
Mark, particularly Luke, but Mark has some Gentile audience as well. Matthew's is very Jewish, but Mark's and Luke's are Luke's especially very Gentile.
Well, usually when you're speaking to a Gentile audience, some of those Jewish things have to be explained, because some Gentiles don't understand all that stuff.
Yeah.
But in this whole book of Mark, he goes into these Gentile areas, which proves his point of the whole passage of the whole letter, that Jesus is not only Savior of the Gentiles, or the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. And the whole book links to that very same concept.
Yeah. When you look at Jesus' ministry, the great majority is in and around Capernaum, within just a few miles, around the shores of Galilee. And again, it's only 8 miles across. It's like 14 or 15 miles across lengthwise. He does go down into Jerusalem. He does travel through Samaria. But the great majority, someone has figured out at least 75% of the miracles happen within about a 15-mile range of Capernaum. It's just isolated right there. Well, if you get outside of that, it's not too far outside of that little circle. Tyre and Sidon exist. But Jesus had to show his disciples, this is for everyone. And they will look back on it. Now, they may not get it just yet, but they will look back on it and say, that's why he took us there. That's why he treated that Phoenician woman like he did. The Samaritan woman like he did.
It always amazes me that Peter doesn't refer to that in the book of Acts.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are you upset about? Jesus did it first.
Right. The perfect opportunity. Now, having said all of that, let's look again and read our text that we're focused in on verse 24, Mark 7:24. From there he arose, he went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him. It probably didn't happen that way, but could she have heard about him from the unclean spirit? They're the only ones who seem to know who he really is at this point. The unclean spirits. Don't take me anywhere near that Son of God. You know, I could see that happening. But however she heard. I'm not suggesting that was it. I'm just saying it could have been a possibility. But she heard of him. So she goes, I'm assuming, to that house, wherever he was, and she falls down at his feet. Mark makes it a point to tell us she was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. Meaning she's from that Mediterranean coastline, somewhere in the area.
She's unclean.
And she's unclean.
She's a Gentile.
And she has a demonic daughter. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now I just want you to stop and think about this and take it in step by step, very slowly. She makes her way to wherever he is. There's probably a crowd. You see, that's pretty common. She makes her way, fights her way in, and begins to beg. Cast the demon out of my daughter. And from context, it seems the daughter is not there. Verse 27. What did Jesus say? Children are fed first. What children?
Israel.
The children of God, the Israelites. Let the children be fed first. For it is not right to take the children's bread. I think this is a dual meaning. I think, as with most Scripture, there's a heavenly meaning and an earthly meaning. And I think he's referring to this socio-economic distress that they've put on the Galileans. It's not right what your people have done to my people. But he's also suggesting theologically, God's people come first. They're in covenant. And we hear this as a he's calling her a dog. I guess in a roundabout way, but he's really telling a parable more than calling her a dog. You don't take the children's bread and throw it out to the dogs. Now we hear that and we immediately apply the children to Israel and her the dog, or her people the dogs. I'm not sure it's as bad as it sounds.
You would understand it. I mean, that scenario was not uncommon to be used. The Samaritan woman recognized how her relationship with the Jews were.
Mm-hmm.
And he was Jew, so it's very possible that she would understand the statement.
Yeah, keep in mind Lazarus was also referred to as a dog in the parable. Even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the master's table.
Well, he also said that he's here for Israel first.
Mm-hmm.
So the children, could be Israel, and then he deals with everybody else.
Yeah. He's
I'm
not
here for
leaving
you.
them out.
Yeah, I'm not here for you, I'm here for them.
Yeah, but he's not leaving them out. He's including them. He's just saying there's an order. Kind of like Adam was created first and then Eve. There's an order. There was a created order. But she answered, verse 28, "Yes, Lord," which was a term of respect, Lord. "Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." In other words, everybody gets some. And he said, and I think you can equate this with what he told another person that he hired or healed from a distance. "I haven't heard this kind of faith in all of Israel, in all the house of Israel." I think this is equivalent. For this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. Because she is showing tremendous faith.
The healing of the centurion's servant.
The healing of the centurion. And she
He
went...
wasn't there for either one of them.
Pardon?
He just spoke.
All he did was speak it. He didn't have to be there. It wasn't a local thing. It was a long distance thing. But she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone.
I think her humility went a long way too.
Her humility was crucial to her faith. And isn't that true anyway? I mean, pride and faith don't have a lot in common, do they?
This is the argument that Paul would later make in the book of Romans. If a Gentile, being not a Jew, lives and carries out the law better than you, what does circumcision have to do with it?
Yeah.
And so Jesus is showing this to the disciples prior to it coming to absolute fulfillment. That she has just as great a faith as anyone in Israel, as did the centurion.
Absolutely.
Greater faith.
Yes.
They have nothing to base it on, other than immediate need.
Right. And hearsay.
And-
Until he shows up.
It doesn't amaze me that she doesn't get offended. I actually understand that, because when you're in absolute desperate need, you're not very easily offended because you're desperate.
Right.
People who get offended easily don't think they need help.
Yeah. Exactly right.
They think you owe them something. They don't want your help.
So the woman at the well kind of did the same thing. She didn't get offended either.
Right. Next week, bread, yeast, forgiveness. We're looking at yeast,
Biscuits.
biscuits,
Donuts.
donuts.
Krispy Kreme.
Biscuits probably don't.
Thank you for coming out tonight. We will take up the concept of bread and yeast and forgiveness next week.